지금부터
Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, we would like to begin today's seminar. Welcome. Welcome to KRDE Road to 2050 Financing Clean Energy Transition Seminar. Once again, thank you very much for your participation. I am going to take you throughout today's seminar. And my name is Jujin Kim, Managing Director for Solutions for Our Climate. This seminar is co-hosted by the National Assembly, the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, and Climate Transparency and Solutions for Our Climate. President Moon Jae-in last April declared that the Central Korean government is going to stop publicly financing overseas coal, and also China and Japan made similar declarations and announcements recently. So other than coal, we also have other fossil fuels, and it's very important that we understand how much public funding is being directed to those fossil fuels, and whether or not those are in line with global efforts to tackle climate change. We have invited over many experts here today, and we have many participants joining us online. So we ask for your kind participation and active participation. Again, below the Zoom screen, you can see Q&A button, so you can click it to upload your questions. Now, before we begin in earnest, I would like to go through and introduce to you our key participants. From the Embassy of Germany in Korea, we have His Excellency Michael Leifenstahl. And as for our presenters, from IEA, we have Mr. Tom House, Head of Energy and Environment Division. And another speaker, we have from the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, we have Deputy Head of Division, Mr. Christoph Wagner. And another speaker is from the Solutions for Our Climate. We have Climate Finance Program Director, Mr. Sejong Yoon. After we listen to three presentations, we are going to invite three speakers for our round table discussion session. So allow me to introduce to you our discussants. From K-Shore, we have Mr. Sundar Peck, VP of K-Shore. He's also the Head of Project Finance Department. Next, from Samsung C&T and Team Lead on Gangneung Project, we have Executive Director Yong-ho Son. And finally, from the Embassy of Germany in Korea, we have Deputy Head of Mission, Mr. Peter Winkler. Shortly, we will be joined by Her Excellency So-young Lee, member of the National Assembly. She is running a little bit late, but when she arrives, we will hear from her congratulatory speech. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite over His Excellency Leifenstahl from the German Embassy in Korea and listen to his welcoming speech.
Many thanks. Dear speakers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining our hybrid seminar today. Let me also thank our partners, Solution for Our Climate and Climate Transparency, which have co-organized this event together with the German Embassy. We are grateful to you, as cooperation with civil society, in our view, is crucial on this issue of climate mitigation and adaptation. And I also would like to use this opportunity to thank Peter Winkler, my deputy, who actually was preparing this from our side. This was very important. Many thanks. The UN Climate Summit COP26 in Glasgow is around the corner, we all know. The recent IPCC report shows what is at stake. Achieve net zero by mid-century or earlier to safeguard livelihoods all over the globe and ensure the future of our economies. The good news is a lot has happened in the past year, despite COVID. In Germany, we have tightened our recent Climate Change Act. Our highest court has tasked us with ensuring that today's decision-making does not unfairly burden the younger generation after 2030. Germany now intends to be climate neutral by 2045 already. In addition, we are setting more ambitious medium-term climate targets. Instead of reducing emissions by 55%, what is actually the EU goal, we aim for at least 65% by 2030. President Moon's announcement to end international public coal finance is promising. This is an important milestone after the Korean government's commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050. We also welcome President Moon's pledge to an ambitious, revised climate goal 2030 in line with net zero. We remain hopeful that Korea's national contribution goes beyond the 40% threshold, which would bring not only Korea, but also the world much closer to the Paris climate goals. There is no doubt that the transformation of the energy sector away from coal, oil and gas brings challenges, but the benefits outweigh the risks by far. Cheaper, cleaner and smarter alternatives already exist. In Germany, almost 50% of electricity comes from renewables. And according to the Provisional Carbon Neutrality Act 2050 scenario, we expect a rapid increase in renewables here in Korea too, and we will need to see the financial sector transitioning to clean energy solutions. However, while we see some movement in this direction, we still need a giant leap to turn our 1.5 degrees commitment into reality. With this seminar, we wanted to touch upon an area that needs further attention in our view. In fact, today's clean energy investment remains far short of what will be required in order to avoid severe impact from climate change. It would need at least to double in the 2020s to be consistent with a well below 2 degrees temperature outcome and not to speak, let alone the 1.5 goal. So the decisive question is, how can both governments and private sectors, investors, best play their part to tackle this challenge, and specifically, how governments can set the right regulatory conditions and set also the right incentives to leverage the maximum amount of private investment into clean energy. The European Union is set to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050. To achieve this, the new EU taxonomy will facilitate sustainable investment decisions. The European Investment Bank is no longer financing fossil fuels, including gas. One other instrument that has the potential to channel clean transition technology is export finance. The gap between today's investment trends and a sustainable pathway is the largest among emerging markets and developing economies. They account for nearly 2/3 of the global population, but only for 1/3 of global investment, and an even smaller 20% share of clean energy investment. However, providing the financial means for the energy transition is not the only bottleneck that requires our urgent attention. The International Energy Agency warns, currently, climate pledges and sustainable finance are not translating into large increases on actual spending on clean energy projects. In short, there is a shortage of projects rather than money. Hence, government policies, regulation, and incentives must not stop at providing the right finance environment. Smart rules and procedures, incentivizing standards, and support for innovation need to go hand in hand with financing concepts. As industrialized, export-oriented nations with a focus on manufacturing, both Korea and Germany have an interest in a sustainable and affordable energy supply. For long, we have been cooperating in this area inter alia through our energy partnership. Together with Korea, we are working on a G20 sustainable finance roadmap in order to better coordinate policy action worldwide. I'm sure that this workshop will be beneficial to take these issues forward. I would like to thank all participants and all speakers and the organizers. And I think in particular, if I may mention, our keynote speaker from the International Energy Agency, Tom House, Christoph Wagner from the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy, and Segong Yoon from Solutions for Our Climate. Germany stands ready to further share its experience and to closely work together with Korea to achieve our common goals for a better future. Many thanks.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Honorable So-young Lee, who is a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Trade and Industry, is running a little bit late. So we're going to move on and listen to our keynote address first, and then once the Member of Parliament Lee arrives, then we can hear from her congratulatory speech. Now, without further ado, I'd like to invite over our first speaker. From IEA, we have Mr. Tom House, Head of Energy and Environment Division. He's going to tell us about Global Energy Roadmap and Net Zero 2050.
Good morning. I hope everyone can see my slides. You can see my first opening slide. I hope so. Well, good morning and thank you very much, or good afternoon on the other side of the world. Greetings from Paris, and thank you very much for this invitation to join you here today. The ambassador has clearly outlined the challenge before us all, and the financing aspect of that in particular. And here at the IEA, we do a range of analysis that explores all of these things. So I start really by looking at the big picture of what the challenge of reaching the Paris goals, of reaching a net zero pathway by 2050 might look like. So this is one snapshot of what happens to our fuel consumption over the decades as we decarbonize, as we move towards 2050 and clean, low carbon economy. We see here in the top half the changing of the fuels away from the domination of oil and gas and coal down to a much more low carbon mix containing a lot more renewables, bioenergy, and so on. Then the other thing to note in the transition that the IEA outlines is the incredible growth of the use of electricity. And this, of course, has investment implications. And this is a story of what investment looks like. Annual capital investment changes, again, over the decades compared to where we are today. And as you see, we're in the trillions. We're just over 2 trillion in the current period. But this needs to double or triple, depending on country, over the decades to come as we undertake the transition in the different sectors, looking at what it looks like in buildings, in transport, in infrastructure, electricity generation, but also in terms of the technology areas, major growth in renewables, in the electricity system itself, and of course in the novel technologies of hydrogen and bioenergy. So the transformation is enormous. It's happening across all the different sectors of the economy. And there's a lot of new investment involved, but another aspect that we need to remember is the importance of existing infrastructure. And that's why it was interesting to hear the ambassador flag up the changing attitudes of international financial institutions who are no longer going to be financing fossil fuel power generation and infrastructure. That's good because already with our existing infrastructure, we face a large challenge in decarbonizing that. you'll see here how we expect existing infrastructure of these days to have quite long lifetimes, depending on how young it is. And we see more worryingly at the bottom here, the large amount of coal power production, which is quite young, particularly in Asia, which has long lifetimes, and that will also need to be decarbonized, amended with carbon capture and storage infrastructure and so on, if we are to also decarbonize that element of existing infrastructure. So both with the build-up of renewables and the build-up and the modification of existing infrastructure, there are quite some challenges ahead of us. Just looking at a quick snapshot of how current investments are panning out around the world, we see here that the trend over the COVID period, if you like, starting in 2019, we've seen dips in infrastructure across the board, except in renewables. We've seen dips during COVID in fossil fuel infrastructure investments in particular, but at the same time, we're also seeing rebounds. So in that sense, the COVID period, horrific as it has been, has not even brought a benefit in a change of direction of investment in the energy sector. We're getting a rebound in terms of oil and gas infrastructure, and showing no sign of change of direction. Thankfully, there's still power led by renewables is the largest part of the current spend, but that change in direction is not nearly as dramatic and significant as it needs to be in every country around the world. Now, of course, we know in the OECD countries such as Korea and Germany, there are major challenges in investment needs, but we've also been looking at where the growth in energy consumption will happen over the coming decades. And that is dominated by countries with of emerging markets and developing economies. And when we have a look there, the story is even starker in terms of the investment need. Here we show current trends of investment need, but in terms of delivering on net zero emissions pathways in these countries, the jump in spending is enormous, as you see. So there's a role here. This is a point to flag up that a lot of the growth will be in emerging economies and developing markets, but there's a clear role for developed economies to play in leading the way in that investment, both within OECD economies and in the developing world, through international financial institutions, but also through the support programs that your countries yourselves run in terms of steering the energy sector away from fossil fuel investment towards decarbonized investment. So there are multiple investment tools to be used, but these have to work in conjunction with improving the local environment in a range of different ways. So we also explore all the different policy measures that can be introduced to help facilitate clean energy transition. In our reports on this pathway, we talk of over 400 different measures that can be introduced. These range from the regulatory for encouraging behavioral change to reforming administrative regimes to reduce the transaction costs from investing in low carbon, from providing investments on the infrastructure side so that the private sector can facilitate on the generation side. So the range of different measures is known by mature countries such as Germany and Korea, who have already started on this pathway. So you're providing very good best practice that other countries around the world can learn from. You're providing finance with which to facilitate and speed up this kind of investment. And an important element also to take home from this graph is the dates that we're looking at. In every sector, there are things we can be doing today. We no longer need to talk of the change that will happen in the medium and the long term. We need to start talking of the change that needs to happen in the short term. And having said that, there's lots of things we can be doing. And so far, again, as the ambassador referred to, we are seeing some ambition across different countries around the world. but not as much as we need to see. We've got NDCs from practically every country around the world, but fewer than half of them have actually updated those NDCs in anticipation of Glasgow. Let's hope at COP at Glasgow in November, we'll see more announcements and a greater strengthening of ambition across these NDCs. And then in terms of long-term strategies and net zero scenarios, again, the numbers are even smaller. And this whole movement, this whole transition, this green transition, has to start with countries accepting the objective, setting their own objectives that suit their particular circumstances, their resource base, their wealth. But we do need to set these. And the IEA is reaching out to countries around the world to help develop these goals, develop these roadmaps, so that governments and private sector can start to get a sense of what the trend will look like, where we can be going over the next decades to ensure that we stay on this pathway. I return to on the question of finance and capital, again, just to flag up that the developed economies, the countries of the OECD today, are in a very good position in terms of having very low cost of capital. And with all the recovery packages, the stimulatory packages that have been developed into the trillions around the world, this is a great opportunity for these countries to lead the way, both in ensuring that the spending of this extra additional recovery money is directed towards green investments and the energy transition, but also it's a chance for these countries to help develop resources and investment in other countries around the world who have not so much access to capital and indeed face much higher capital costs, as these illustrative graphs explain. The costs in the developing world, cost of capital is so much higher, and this is an aspect of capital markets which we need to address, but we can also address directly through ongoing investment strategies through IFIs and government programs. I last wanted to flag up that as well as the talk of investment and costs that we necessarily face, there is a major upside to this whole energy transition. We must remember the new industries that we are stimulating, the new technologies that are going to grow, are all bringing new jobs. And it's important to reflect on this, and also important for front runners, such as Korea and Germany, to be able to take advantage of these new investments and the new jobs and the new industries that come with them. These are major employment opportunities, they're export industry opportunities, and we should grasp these opportunities. So that's my very quick run through the different aspects that we need to consider around the world in terms of trends, technologies, finance, investment stories, and the employment benefits that come with it all. Thank you very much. This is the last summary of all the different measures we need to take, the priority actions. Again, I stress that we now have to take these actions now. We no longer need to talk of the medium, the long term. Let's take these actions in our current legislative programs, in our current legislative periods, to start implementing these measures such that they will have an effect by 2030 and the decades beyond. Thank you very much.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. House, for that insightful presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Mr. Tom House, Head of Energy and Environment Division of IEA. And during the presentation from the National Assembly, we have our Member of Parliament, So-young Lee, with us. So we would like to take this moment to invite her for her congratulatory speech, and we're going to have a group photo session before we move on to the second presentation. Would you like to come forward for your speech? Good morning and good afternoon. My name is So-young Lee, Member of Parliament. I'd like to first apologize for arriving late. I had another commitment right before this seminar, so my apologies once again. I actually said hi to His Excellency, Ambassador Reifenstahl, a few days ago, so it's great to see you again here. When it comes to energy transition, I believe that Germany is working on phasing out nuclear as well as coal, and therefore, for Korea, it's like an exemplary country. Very good reference for us to benchmark. And as a matter of fact, when I was working in the private sector as an expert, and now that I'm here at the National Assembly, I've been leading discourse on phasing out coal. And I've actually studied and reviewed many coal phase out initiatives of Germany. So Germany has always been a great inspiration for me. So I believe that Germany is a good partner country and a colleague for Korea when it comes to carbon energy transition. So it's a great honor and pleasure of mine to be co-hosting this seminar. In Korea, it appears as if we have achieved a lot. However, I feel like we have yet to do more. What I'm trying to say is that last October, we did declare 2050 net zero. Many actually were skeptical about that. And this year, July, the government announced to stop international coal financing, and carbon neutrality 2050 was legislated into a law. So in a very short period of time, it appears as if we have come a long way. But at the same time, I believe that there were many key decisions that are not being made. For example, 30–40% coal fire power plants that we still depend on. At what speed and how much are we going to phase them out, and when are we going to make them zero? I think that we have yet to set our goal. And we still talk about 2050 net zero, but we don't have a clear understanding or idea about our 2030 goal. We are yet hesitant to have a more ambitious NDC for our 2030. So I see that we are showing both sides in a way. For the entire society in Korea, and all the stakeholders need to come together in order to realize this 2050 carbon neutrality goal. It should not be just a simple rhetoric that politicians promote. I believe that in order to drastically reduce carbon emissions, I think that we together need to act today. And I believe that we still have to do more. And I believe that many of such people are joined here today, and I'm going to do my part in order to contribute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lawmaker Lee. We ask for the understanding of those joining via Zoom. We will have a photo session for those who are joining here in person.
Peter.
좀 앞으로 나오셔야지. 화면 뭐가 찍힐 수 있어?
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. Thank you for waiting. Those who are joining via online, we will now go on to our second presentation. We will be hearing a presentation on finding of the Korea Oil and Gas Finance Report. And this presentation will be provided by Sejong Yoon from Solutions for Our Climate. He is the Climate Finance Program Director. Hello, everyone. I am Sejong Yoon from Solutions for Our Climate. I will be presenting on Korea's public financing for oil and gas. Korea regarding coal financing was criticized for a long time. And finally, during the US Korea summit, it was announced that Korea will abandon further public financing of coal projects. And now we are entering a phase in which such financing will be stopped for coal. However, coal is just half of the problem. The CO2 emissions coming from burning of fossil fuels, in particular, half of the GHG comes not from coal, but from natural gases and oil. Therefore, we need to now go beyond coal. We need to transit from public financing for oil and gas. And in the first half of this year, we looked at Korea's major public organizations, financial organizations, and we looked at for the past 10 years from 2012 to 2011 to 2021 of how much public financing was put in by Korean public financial organizations such as K-SURE and Korea Exim Bank and KDB. And we saw that for Korea's public financing of coal, it was 10 billion, but oil and gas was 127 billion. Therefore, coal, as this picture shows, was just the tip of the iceberg. And if you look at it by year, the portion in gray, which is coal, the brown, which is gas and oil, is much larger. In 2013, it peaked and then it is now going down. However, during the past 6 years, continuously, we see a lot of public financing still going into oil and gas. And if we compare oil and gas, the oil and gas is on par. The problem is that this trend, just as Tom House presented, it does not live up to the climate change targets. According to UNEP, it says that for us to meet the climate change targets, we have to reduce fossil fuel production. And this is the production gap report. This report is announced every year. And according to this report, we need to reduce global fossil fuel production by 6% every year. However, in reality, it is increasing by 2% per year. And one of the big issues that leads to this is the financing of these projects. IEA in the first half of this year published an important report, 2050 Global Energy Net Zero Roadmap, and they said that the fossil fuel demand will go down, and by 2050, coal minus 90%, and for gas and oil, it will be reduced by 55% and 75% respectively. In particular, an area that we are interested in is natural gas. That is because out of fossil fuels, LNG is considered to be cleaner fossil fuels. And that is why in Korea, as a policy for LNG, we have plans to increase the dependency and consumption of LNG. However, the issue is that it is underestimated, the emissions. It is a gas, and that is why it is different from oil and coal. The production process, in that process, methane is produced in the process of extraction, and then you need to cool it down minus 130 degrees, and then it has to be transported utilizing a vessel because of Korea's landscape. Therefore, due to such a process, it is not efficient or sufficient, rather, to just to see the end use, because This means that 45% of the emissions comes out from the production and transportation, which is not the end-use process. Therefore, if you look at the entire life cycle of LNG compared to coal power plants, the GHG is nearly 80% of coal power plants, what is being produced by emitted through LNG. Therefore, LNG cannot be a bridge as we go toward an energy transition, and that is the scientific results. Then let us look at the financing throughout Korea's oil and gas value chain. We can divide it into upstream, midstream, and downstream. For the upstream, it is the extraction and exploration. Midstream is mostly related to transportation and pipelines, and downstream it is refinery, meaning the crude oil. And Korea's public financing is distributed evenly for these three parts, upstream, midstream, and downstream. For the upstream, 32.24 billion has been financed, and it was through the resources development projects of co-gas, and there was a lot that was supported via SKENS and GS Energy and POSCO International, in particular in areas such as Australia, Mozambique of Africa, and shale gas, exploration in the United States were many projects that were carried out by Korea through its public financing. And for midstream, an important part is the shipping. And the blue graph that you see in the middle, and the ship-related investment is orange, and it's pretty much the same. So the midstream area, the public financing has been done mostly in the shipbuilding and construction part. The majority of the public financing in the midstream sector. So it goes into ship financing. And for the downstream, it is the projects, offshore projects. And this was the downstream part, which went into Korean construction companies. And as was mentioned, for the mid, down, and upstream, it was divided pretty evenly. And there are important industries that were supported: shipping. And for shipping, 46% of all Korea's oil and gas public financing has been invested in shipping and offshore plant financing. Korea, shipbuilding accounts for 44.2% of the global market. That is because the industry itself is so big, and the demand for this industry is related to the transportation of fossil fuels, such as the ships and offshore plants and transportation vessels. As you can see in this picture, Korea's LNG gas carriers, Korea accounts for 80 to 90% of the supply of such LNG carriers and oil carriers. Drill ships, FSRU, also receive a lot of public financing in its operations. For the construction, we can look at it by regions. In particular, for the petrochemical plants and refineries, there's a lot of demand for construction in the downstream area, and it is centered mostly in Middle East and Southern America and Southeast Asia. So the reason why we are concerned about public financing being injected into these areas is because it is actually leading to more transition risk. Public financing is being provided to private sector companies in the fashion of loans and guarantees, and the public finance, they have a big and high credit worthiness. Therefore, it is supporting Korean companies as they export, and it is a national support to certain industries. That is the role that such public financing provides. And as was explained by IEA, by just transiting the infrastructure that we already have, that is a burden enough. But if there is continuous support to newly built infrastructure for fossil fuel, this leads to a situation in which infrastructure is being supported for fossil fuels, but it should be converted to renewable infrastructure. We have limited resources, and the government, when they provide support to certain industries, we should think about sustainable industrial structure, and it should have a policy target when it carries out such financing, public financing, and that was one of the implications that we could draw. And there's also the financial risk that such investment has. So the new resource projects, it has to, when it considers the situation of energy transition, it might be exposed to stranded asset risk. Already, Korean companies, it is still participating in overseas oil and gas projects, and such public financing may lead to loss in the long run. Therefore, it is not appropriate for the financial soundness of public financing. Already, overseas public financing has changed courses. European Union and UK, they already announced that they will move away from fossil fuels, and two Swedish financial investment corporations said that they will stop investing in fossil fuels. And even the United States, which was a stronghold in fossil fuel investment, said that for multinational development agencies and banks, if they invest in fossil fuel projects, that they will no longer support this, such as World Bank. Of course, in Korea, we are seeing some movements. For the case of Keksem Bank, K-SURE, and KDB declared support for TCFD. They announced that they supported the task force climate-related financial disclosures. Through such efforts, the public financial institutions can manage and assess climate-related risks. And these are some of the expectations that we can have. Energy transition always takes place in two directions. There will be a reduction, there has to be reduction in investments of fossil fuels, and there has to be investment into renewable energy, clean energy that we need. And what I'm presenting today is about reducing investment in fossil fuels and reducing dependency on fossil fuels. Thank you for listening.
발제 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for that insightful presentation. For financing, and we heard about how there are 13 times of public financing being injected in LNG. So thank you very much. That was very shocking. We will now move on to our third speaker. So energy transition and the role of financing. We're going to hear about Germany's experience. And for this presentation, we have Mr. Christoph Wagner from the German Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning to this part of the world, and good afternoon to Korea. Yes, I think my presentation will really fit in very well to what we just heard. I intend to focus a bit more on the incentives side, maybe to give our a Korean audience a bit of orientation. I represent the German instrument of export credit guarantees, which is often labeled with Euler-Hermes guarantees. And our direct equivalent in Korea would be K-SURE, and to some extent also Korea Exim. So just to give you some orientation where we are located in the German system. In my presentation, I would first like to focus a bit on what we do currently, what our instrument is capable of, and then I would like to highlight a bit what we are intending to do in the future, what our process is to adapt our instrument to climate change. So maybe you can turn to the next slide, please. Right. The purpose of our German export credit scheme basically is safeguarding jobs. While I speak, you can look over the screen and look for some keywords. But I think in a nutshell, that is our mission, safeguarding jobs in the German industries and especially the exporting industries. All the other points listed here somehow are related to this. That's one of the challenges we are facing. That's a question: is this mission, is that really still up to date, or do we have to include other policy objectives? And obviously, since we are speaking about climate change here, would climate change mitigation and adaptation be part of our mission in the future? I will come back to this later, but for the time being, I think it's important to keep this in mind. Let us turn to the next slide. And actually, you have seen this very slide just a moment ago. It was slide 16 of the previous presentation. This is just the German version of it. But please, let's immediately turn to the next one, because we know this actually already. I will try to give you a bit of an understanding of how we operate. And now don't be confused by all those arrows. Those arrows are helpful, but let's focus a bit on the actors in a very standard export transaction. And let's focus first on the main drivers of an export transaction on the right side. That's the exporter and obviously his or her foreign customer. Just to make it a bit more transparent, let's assume we have as a foreign customer a brewery in Thailand. A brewer in Thailand needs a new bottle filling machine to fill his beer into bottles. He finds a supplier in Germany, a company, medium-sized company, that is producing bottle filling machines. They come to a contract. The exporter produces the machine and is ready to supply it to the foreign customer. Now, both companies, exporter and the Thailand buyer, the brewery, are both medium-sized companies. And that means they're always short of cash. The exporter at this stage, when the machine is produced and ready for shipment, has already used a lot of his or her financial means in terms of material, of working hours. So he needs to be paid as soon as possible. On the other hand, the brewery in Thailand, also a medium-sized company, cannot provide so much cash in one installment. So they need an arrangement for deferred payment. So the exporter turns to his bank in Germany and asks them to give the brewery, their customer in Thailand, a loan, so they can make a deferred payment in various installments. Now, in many transactions of that style, that's it. It's the exporter, the customer, and the bank financing the deal and allowing deferred payment over time. But then there are cases where the bank in Germany is hesitant to grant the loan. That can be for risk purposes. This can be because the transaction is too small or too big, or many other reasons. And then our instrument comes into place and is offering assistance. We would screen the deal, and if we find it viable, if we find it is a good deal, and what is a good deal, I will explain a bit later. If we find it's worthy of our support, we offer the bank a guarantee. So when their loan gets into default, if it gets bust, if there are political or commercial risks realizing, we pay, or indemnify as we call it, the bank for their loss in the loan agreement. The bank is out of trouble at the entire transaction. Now, this guarantee we give based on the foreign budget. We don't have a budget of our own. We can draw immediately and directly on the German federal budget, which is of course huge and gives us plenty of opportunities. We are, of course, very risk aware. So it's very rare that we really have a default. So taxpayers' money is put at a certain risk by us, but usually it is not spent. It stays in the federal budget. If the transaction goes well, not one penny of taxpayers' money is being spent. And that makes this instrument quite smart and also powerful. Now, let's turn to the next slide, please. Here you see our criteria for what is a good deal or a deal worthy of our support, as we call it. There are two main sets of criteria. The first one is risk. I don't want to highlight this anymore in this presentation, even though I might mention that climate aspects are also increasingly becoming a factor of our risk assessment. Just to throw in one keyword, that would be stranded assets. But I don't want to highlight this any further. Then we have a set of criteria which are a bit vaguely described here as the transaction must be eligible. Now, this is the sum of, I would say, all policy aspects. Here we have aspects like, is the transaction corruption-free? Is it in line with social, human rights, or environmental standards, and the like? And I will highlight this a bit further in the next slide, but here just to mention this is a wide set of policy criteria we have to observe, and the transaction has to be in line with. Then we have a number of international restrictions and regulations to observe. This kind of business is regulated by OECD rules, the OECD arrangement on officially supported export credits, and a number of other rules, especially for us Europeans. EU state aid rules have to be observed. And last but not least, of course, since we are operating directly with the federal budget, the federal budget law is, of course, a major framework for us to observe. Also, nothing I want to go into detail here. So maybe let's turn to the next slide. And here I have listed some of the eligibility criteria a transaction has to observe. It's not exhaustive, but it gives you an idea on what is taken into account when we decide whether to support a deal or not. I have highlighted in bold the environmental, social, and human rights compatibility. Those are criteria that are also agreed internationally in the OECD. And they, more or less up to today, also deliver our criteria for assessing the climate impact of transaction and whether it is in line with our climate policy goals. Now, obviously, this is a grown set of rules that is maybe no longer up to speed. It's not specific enough to address all the climate issues we need to take into account. And therefore, we have decided, and we are not alone, many other systems of our line of business have done the same or are doing the same. We have come to the conclusion we need a climate strategy at the national level to better align what we do with our transition goals for our economy and with the Paris goals. So now let's turn to the next slide. Thank you very much. And don't get confused. I will make this far easier than it looks. But first, two words of caution. What I'm presenting you here is now not what we are doing currently, but what we are working on, what we intend to do in the near future. Now, this is work in progress, so please use this slide carefully. As you know, we have a new government very soon. General elections in Germany were last Sunday. And it's of course the privilege of any new government to scrap this and tell us to do something entirely different. But for the time being, this reflects our efforts to align our instrument with transition needs. And this is the best insight I can give you at this point in time. As I said, it's work in progress, so part of it is already implemented. Other aspects are in the test phase or under discussion. To start with, let's concentrate a bit on the colored dots on the right side. As you see in the headline, we call this a traffic light system. Now, you might wonder whether German traffic lights have white lights. No, they don't. But when we designed the system, we realized we needed one more category to show than a traffic light has colors. So our traffic lights look very much standard, but it didn't work out completely for our system. Let's briefly start with the red dot at the bottom. That's transactions that will be or are restricted. And restricted means we do no longer provide cover. A good example for this is support for coal-fired power plants. We have ended our support for this. As soon as discussions on the review of the CFSU in the OECD arrangement have been concluded, we hope we will be able to end our support also for coal-related infrastructure like mining and transport. Over time, and this is a characteristic of this approach, the number of transactions that fall under the red category will obviously grow. The more capable our industry becomes to be climate adapted and aligned with the Paris goals, the more transactions will of course be rated as red if they don't meet those criteria. And if we move a bit up in the hierarchy, we come to a set of transactions that is labeled as amber. And those will be transactions that do not receive the standard conditions of cover, but to some extent they will be discriminated. So conditions for cover will be not standard, but a bit more inferior. This is to provide encouragement in terms of technology just to better, and it's also a signal to industries that a certain segment of technology is actually on the way out of being eligible for cover. So what's in amber today, that will be the signal, will maybe be in red tomorrow. Then we have, of course, a large number of transactions that for the time being remain unchanged. They have not a particularly bad impact on climate policy issues. But on the other hand, they are not in a specific way helpful for climate policy goals. So they're sort of neutral and would receive the standard set of cover conditions. Then we have the green dot, and I will concentrate a bit on this for the rest of this presentation. Under green, we have transactions that, from our point of view, deserve a preferential treatment when it comes to conditions for cover. So we want to provide incentives and help those transactions to push through specifically. For the time being, we are considering to use the EU taxonomy that has been mentioned earlier by Ambassador Reifenstuhl as a benchmark. But this is still under discussion. There are a lot of aspects to be considered, whether this benchmark is going to work. But we will discuss this also with our European colleagues in the OECD. So we are hoping very much to have an international discussion soon on what the EU taxonomy could provide as a benchmark. Now let me share a number of observations we have made when designing preferential conditions for green transactions. I just mentioned benchmarks. Benchmarks is really an issue. One would think that at this point in history, there are plenty of benchmarks around identifying climate-friendly or maybe not so climate-friendly transactions and giving them some sort of rating. But when we screened what's available internationally, there was really not so much available to work with. And if I briefly go back to the amber transactions, there we use the environmental and human rights and social criteria of the OECD. That's a bit of an interim solution. They are not really tailored for this, and we are looking to replace this benchmark as soon as possible with something that works better. So benchmarks is really an issue. We are hesitant to create our own benchmarks for the obvious reason that this is not really our field of expertise. And obviously, if you create your own benchmark for your own business, that's always a moral hazard problem too. So we would very much rely on benchmarks that have been drafted elsewhere. That's one challenge we have to tackle. And another challenge, and that I really would like to highlight, is that restricting and ending support is very easy. We should just stop doing it. But when we are asked to ramp up our support for green transactions, for transactions that help climate goals, not only in Germany, but since we support export, they would help very much climate policy issues in other countries, especially medium and low-income countries. When we ask to ramp this up, we very often have to say, yes, we would very much like to do this because this is our business, but we are operating in a really highly and tightly regulated field of work. I mentioned previously some of the rules that govern what we do. That's the restrictions of the OECD arrangement. It's restrictions of our own mandate. It's restrictions of federal budget law, EU state aid law. We also need to observe anti-subsidy rules of the WTO, and so it goes on. I mean, all those rules obviously have historically and traditionally their place and purpose. That's very clear. At the same time, in those rules, climate policy is not yet reflected. So while we are asked to do more for climate-friendly investments and transactions, those rules very often are a straitjacket that tells us we just can't. So what needs to happen beyond asking ECAs like us or KSURE to do more, this is also adjusting the regulatory framework. And Ambassador Reifenstuhl briefly highlighted this in his opening remarks when he pointed to the fact that sometimes in financing the transition, money is not really the problem. It's sometimes more the availability of projects and the right frameworks that is channeling money to those projects. So here we really need work, and quite clearly as a foreign trade support instrument, we are policy takers. We are not policy makers. So we need also, I think, a shift of awareness in some other areas like anti-subsidy laws and financial regulation to allow us to channel private money with our instrument to the right purposes. Okay, I would leave our national system here and very briefly like to turn to the international scenery. Could we have the next slide, please? What I have described here as our national efforts is somehow shared by a number of countries, European countries for the time being, in the Export Finance for Future Forum. It's being inspired by France and founded in 2021. Can we see the next slide, please? And it's working on the restrictions for fossil fuels at the moment. Ending of coal is more or less a done deal. Support for other fossil fuels is the work ahead. But we're also working on ideas on how to better incentivize transactions with our instruments. Now, I mentioned this forum here because it is not a closed club. We very much would like to discuss our ideas with interested parties and listening to the ambitions of Korea with regard to climate change and the phase out of fossil fuels. I think there might be some interest on the Korean side to maybe liaise, to maybe discuss with us what we are doing and whether Korea maybe at this point in time or later might want to join this set of countries. We are open. We are not a closed club again, and if there is some interest on the Korean side to know more about this, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would very much give you an idea of what we are working on. Okay, I think my time is up, and I think also your attention span is up. So thank you very much for this, yeah, looking forward to the discussions we are going to have. Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So Mr. Wagner talked in detail about Germany's different programs. Thank you. Now we're going to move on and have our roundtable discussion session. The discussion session is going to be moderated by Mr. Sejong Yoon from SFOC. The mic is all yours. Yes, thank you very much. Once again, I would like to extend my gratitude to all the presenters, and I would like to also thank all the panel discussants from K-Shore. We have Mr. Song Dal-Bak, and from the Samsung CNT, we have Yong-Ho Son. So thank you, and also Mr. Winkler for your valuable time. So as we put together this roundtable discussion session, we thought about public financing organization, K-Shore's perspective, and also we wanted to hear also from a player in the marketplace, Samsung CNT. And after listening to their positions and perspectives, I thought that we could also collect some questions and opinions from the floor and also from our presenters to have a in-depth discussion. So after listening to Mr. Peck and Mr. Sond, we're going to invite over other presenters and share opinions and ask questions. After that, we're going to also invite questions from our participants. You can upload your questions in the chat box if you have any. So without further ado, I'd like to invite over Mr. Peck, VP of K-Shore.
오늘 이 자리에
Yes, thank you very much. As a public credit organization, I guess I'm the only one represented here at the table. Aside from K-Shore, I hope to see many other similar representatives from other similar organizations, but I guess it felt uneasy. I believe that Mr. Yoon delivered a very good presentation. As you have seen from the presentation, the Korean industrial structure is very much focused on fossil fuel. And we have an industrial structure that has a lot of competitiveness when it comes to fossil fuels. We are the best LNG ship makers, and we have the best nuclear power plant makers. We also have best coal power plant makers and gas power plant makers. And in other sectors of our industry, we have many businesses and exporters that are performing pretty well. They have a lot of competitive edge in the market. So public financing and also public export credits, yes, have been extended to these businesses over the years. It was well put together by Mr. Yoon earlier. So what are we going to do in the future going forward? First of all, I think that it's important to clear some misunderstandings. So public financing was extended to those industries, but because of public financing, did our industry develop in that direction? Well, to that statement, or to that question, what I want to say is that, well, public credit agencies only reflect Korea's industrial structure and does not lead shaping the Korean industrial structure. Overseas, there are power plants and also power plants, and Korea's public financing doesn't really take up a lot. KDB does extend public funding, yes, but the percentage, I wouldn't say, is not that high. And another thing I'd like to point out is that public financing, we also look at eco-friendly projects, and we also look at fossil fuel projects. It's not like that we selected fossil fuel projects over clean and renewable projects. That's not true. Yes, if you look at clean power projects, solar PV, wind, it's not like we ignored these renewable projects and only focused on fossil fuels. It was because of our industrial structure. They were focused on fossil fuels. And if you look at environmental aspects, public credit agencies now look at environmental friendliness when reviewing. However, we look at more whether or not a certain project help our industrial development. So I agree that we have to strike a balance between developing our industry as well as protecting our environment. One more thing I'd like to point out is that when it comes to coal power, recently, K-Shore announced that we're not going to extend any public credit to new coal power plants. It was made very clear. And OECD also has a guideline for ECAs or export credit agencies. So when extending public funding, OECD has this guideline, and we have to comply that. And along with EU, the United States and Korea actually proposed that guideline that we don't provide any more public financing to new coal power projects. And when it comes to new coal, we should not build any more power projects, but at the same time, we are also discussing not allowing any public financing for excavation or exploration. So we don't have an international consensus yet, so we're going to continue discussing with our international partners next year as well. Today, we talked about oil as well as natural gas, and fossil fuel obviously encompass all those, but OECD actually distinguishes oil and gas. I didn't yet start the discussion on natural gas nor oil. It only has a guideline for coal. And aside from coal power, we also have a guideline for environmental reviews. We have three different categories for different projects, A, B, and C. A project groups would have a significant impact on our environment. And so for category A projects, potentially, we would have to do environmental, social, impact analysis, and they would have to take some countermeasures, or else we would not extend any public financing nor support that project. So I think that environmental impact analysis is also required for renewable energy projects. What I'm trying to say is this. Recently, for wind power, there are some concerns that they could distort the sea life. And aside from the carbon neutrality, that is also an environmental issue, potential issue, and therefore we would have to do environmental impact assessment for those wind projects as well. Going forward, what we have in mind is this. As Mr. Yoon mentioned during his presentation, when it comes to fossil fuel, yes, we do have a big portfolio, and it is our goal to reduce the size of that fossil fuel-related portfolio and increase renewable and clean energy-related portfolio. So that is going to be our challenge. And perhaps we can extend incentives to facilitate that. And just before this discussion session, I believe that it was from Germany, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Christoph Wagner, that is. I think that he pointed out the importance of incentives and following. Because of international regulations and rules, I think that there are some limitations as to how much incentives we can provide, but we have to look at individual projects and see whether or not those are helpful for climate change and also environment. So we're trying to comply with the international regulations and rules, but at the same time try to extend more incentives for those eco-friendly projects. Last year, we also supported about $500 million worth of renewable energy-related projects, and that is the goal for this year as well. So in this period of transition, I believe that we're trying to extend and expand more renewable energy-related projects while reducing fossil fuel-related projects. Recently, we also talk about ESG a lot. Many businesses are also paying attention to ESG, and many businesses are introducing different measures to promote ESG. And I think that there was also a mention on LNG. Now, if you look at Korea's energy supply and demand plan, the plan is actually to increase the ratio of LNG going forward. That is problematic. And when it comes to replacing fossil fuels, many yes, there are some skepticism and doubts whether LNG can serve as a bridge, but some do believe that it can. So it's something that we need to address. And gas exploration projects, we recently supported one. And as you drill to generate natural gas, we can also use latest technologies in order to capture greenhouse gas that is emitted. So capture technology is something that we can also publicly finance. So yes, on one side, we can promote and extend support for renewable energies, and at the same time, we can help to reduce carbon greenhouse gas emissions for those fossil fuel related projects. With that, I would like to end my discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We heard from Seung-dal Baek, Vice President of K-SURE.
And he talked about how K-SURE reflected the characteristics of Korea's industrial structure and provided public funding and public financing for those industries over the years, and how he understands the need to strike a balance between renewables, creating jobs, and also reducing those fossil fuel dependence. Next, I would like to invite over Mr. Son from Samsung C&T.
Hello, everyone. I am here representing the industry and construction companies. It is an honor for me to be participating. And so, as I participate today, I would like to speak about the concerns of industry and what we would like to ask. So, what is being felt by the industry? So Korea's construction industries overseas project, it's 13 trillion and overseas is 120 billion. And looking at the project export, it is for combined power plants and also solar power plants. And looking at the market, it is Middle East, CIS, Southeast Asia, and for the Middle East, we are replacing outdated facilities and desalination projects, and we also have solar power plants, and there's the Qatar gas plant, and Middle East, they have a lot of sunlight and they are installing solar power plants, but they are also utilizing LNG combined power plants in order to work as a backup for the intermittencies of renewable energy. And they so have such LNG terminal constructions, and Korea is participating. CIS, Australia, and in the United States, we are seeing a lot of requests for building of solar power plants. Korean construction companies for the past 5 years experienced a depression of oil prices, leading to a depression of the industry. And there has, however, been some rebounding of the industry due to replacement of outdated facilities. But in the global market, raw material costs are increasing, labor costs are increasing, Chinese companies are entering the competition, and there's a lot of competition. So looking at Korea's construction companies' status, so just as K-SURE VP said, we are outstanding in our technology, in our construction abilities, and on our bidding of such projects, there are companies that can be more cost effective, and there are also ones that can provide the most efficient, energy efficient power plants. And also there are companies that can provide financing in the best way, and they team up together. And in this situation, if financing is stopped, then it will lead to a impact to the construction companies in Korea and material suppliers in Korea. As was seen in the media, there was a large conglomerate that sold off its construction part. This was in the media, but not just this. There's a situation where it's very difficult to find new recruits in this area. And those in the plant industry, you have to think about their emotions as well. Up to now, we have been participating in directly and indirectly generating power, and they had pride that they were contributing in the development of civilization, but now they are being deemed as villains of climate change. For the current generation and next generation, we have to prepare for the future, but for energy transition, we need to think about the speed and the cost. Renewable energy, transiting to it, I agree to that. And for us to transit to such renewables, we need a bridge such as LNG, because just with the renewable energy, we cannot overcome the situations that such as the consistency and of electricity and distribution and the transmission lines. And even in the Middle East, they are utilizing such fossil fuel power plants. And there are many plans to convert to solar power plants, but the solar power plants need to overcome challenges in terms of storage during the time when solar power plants are not in operation. There has to be backup of power during that time. And in Southeast Asia, instead of coal, they have decided to use LNG, and they are expanding their facilities for this. If this is discontinued and asking them to directly convert and transit to renewable, that will be deemed as unfair, because they are asking for them to use high cost, low efficient energy, whereas the advanced countries have already developed themselves. And when you try to convert to renewable energy, it is associated with extraordinary costs. And in Korea, we are talking about 2050 net zero, and KEPCO's energy selling is 56 trillion, but purchasing price was 80 some trillion. So for energy storage, we have to invest 1,200 trillion won. And for solar and wind power plants, we need 800 trillion won to be invested. And considering all of this such investment that's required, we need to have a balanced outlook, and we need to have extra budget of 30 trillion due to address COVID situation. And we need to think about the opportunity cost and the cost associated with the transiting to renewable energy. We need to think about what sacrifices that we need to take. European countries, their electricity costs are 2 times that of Korea. And we hear that in the UK, the energy cost is going up by 7 times. And we are seeing in China where they are seeing blackouts because of the unstable power supply. And for energy transition, for the assets that have already been invested, there has to be compensation. In Germany, in the energy transition situation, we can see cases of conflicts and also cases of compensation. There has to be just compensation and appropriate exiting so that there should not be social discord and minimization of social conflicts in the process of energy transition. And there is also the environmental issues related to renewable energy. The high density energy of oil and gases, it has fossil fuels, therefore it's emitting CO2, but because it is low efficient energy compared to coal, you need, for example, 40 times of land in order to generate solar energy. And for 40 gigawatts of solar power plants, you need a space of 9 times of soil. And there's also the discarding of solar power plants. And we need to strengthen the transmission and the distribution networks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Beck, Mr. Son, that is. So he talked about how Korean businesses have competitive edge and competitive superiority when it comes to construction-related technologies and power plant-related technologies, and how we need LNG as a bridge fuel. And also in the transition, we also need to have just a transition for the workers working in those industries. So that was the gist of his presentation. Thank you very much. Once again, Mr. Beck and Mr. Son, listening to your discussions, once again, it reminded clearly to us how challenging this issue is. And I think that it was brought up numerous times today. So for this energy transition, are we going to use another fossil fuel, LNG? And what is the role of the LNG going to be going forward? I think that we have a lot of discourse going on. So with regard to this topic, Mr. Tom House from IEA actually delivered a presentation. So IEA's net zero roadmap 2050, in that scenario, what is the role of LNG? And 90% of the energy has to be sourced using renewables by 2050. So what is the practicalness and also economic efficiency associated with that? So Mr. Tom House, what is your opinion?
Thank you. Well, as I showed in my graph earlier, we see an ongoing role for gas and LNG in the transition, but the transition is getting shorter and shorter. So it means that by 2040, 2050, there's minimal gas and LNG in our energy systems, and that which is there is either used in conjunction with carbon capture and storage. So one can go on using infrastructure if there is so much remaining investment and infrastructure in fossil fuels, then it can be adapted and we use more CCUS. Or failing that, there are residuals, residual use of fossil fuels, which then need to be compensated for with negative emissions elsewhere, either carbon capture and storage elsewhere or other carbon sinks, direct air capture or BECCS. So there are other technologies which can compensate. That's why we talk of net zero, not purely zero. But this is in the power sector, this becomes negligible. We reserve that kind of compensating of final emissions for really difficult to abate sectors in industry, maybe a bit in aviation. But in the power sector, we face very little of that at all. Again, this is depending on national circumstances, but we shouldn't be expecting to have much of that by 2050. So for me, that's the story that despite where we are today with high prices around the world, the expectation is that the energy transition will spur demand for non-fossil fuels, and the market for fossil fuels will shrink. So that's the expectation. But it's been interesting to hear from the other panelists this morning the role of their major heavy industries, their manufacturing industries, the construction of power plants and turbines and things. And here, I'd be interested to know whether it's already on the radar of the role that their industries can play in a decarbonized energy system. Decarbonized insofar as how much of the technology and the infrastructure that is available today can be adapted to work with hydrogen in production, or with CCUS, or with biogas instead of with natural gas. So is that shift already starting to happen in your manufacturing industries? Because, as I say, our expectation is that the traditional markets or traditional fossil fuels is on a steep decline.
네, 감사합니다. 국제 에너지
Thank you. We heard from IEA and
So, of course, there can be some price differences at the moment. However, long term, by 2050, when it comes to power, fossil fuel use is going to be reduced significantly, and greenhouse gas emissions will still remain in some sectors, limited sectors, for example, aviation. So thank you. There was also a question. So in this process, we have heavy industries, construction, engineering industries. Are they using hydrogen CCS for power generation to create new opportunities, new markets? So from Korea's perspective, what is our view? I think that was the question. So Mr. Son, would you like to answer that question? Yes.
So I will answer simply. In order to reduce CO2, of course, now this is no longer an option. This is mandatory for all industries. So however, as a process of realizing energy transition, in some cases, we will have to utilize fossil fuels, but in order to minimize CO2 emissions, there is investment into technology such as CCUS and ammonia generation. There are such investment in these areas. But what is unfortunate is that if for such technology to be commercialized and to be economically feasible, it will take 10 years. And it is in the pilot phase at the moment. So for it to be completely commercialized, it will take 10 years. This should be considered. And through CCUS, even if carbon is sequestrated, where are we going to put it? And it can be put in the continental shelf, but for it to be stored at the continental shelf, there is space required, and there is an imbalance in the space available for the continental shelf, and there are technical challenges there. Therefore, we need to think about the reality, and there has to be financial support for this. If there is financial support, of course, this could be expedited.
Thank you very much. Christopher Wagner, I think, received some questions from Mr. Peg and Son. So Germany is a industry-oriented and manufacturing-centered country. So I believe that the concerns of K-Sure and also Samsung C&T probably was something that also was felt by German businesses. So you talked about eligibility criteria, and what are the industries that are affected by those eligibility criteria? And as you were developing that criteria, how did you involve different stakeholders, and how did you communicate with them?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, I think in terms of our industrial base and structure, I think Korea and Germany indeed have many things in common. We are both heavy industrialized, and in fact, the transition that's necessary for our industries is enormous. Talking now specifically about the eligibility criteria as they are today, I would say they have grown over time, been agreed in the OECD at an international level, and they rely heavily on well-known sets of standards, basically by the World Bank and the IFC. So I think this was let's say an evolutionary process with stakeholder involvement always along the way, and we were operating with criteria that are well known to companies worldwide. So I think that is how this happened today. What we experience now really is, and if you think a moment back to my presentation, export credit guarantees, they have one foot in the private in the private finance sector with the banks, and another foot in industries. Now we're working with the exporters, industries, and with the banks. And what we encounter currently is that in terms of time, both live in different universes. Peer pressure in the financial sector is huge, and I think the progress there towards carbon neutrality is very fast. I think our industries have very well understood the challenge. They have very well understood where they have to go. But of course, technical innovation and the change of a product portfolio is something that is taking more time maybe than changing the policy guidelines of a bank. And maybe picking briefly up the question asked by Mr. House. One issue we are discussing at the moment is of course the use of hydrogen as one of the key pillars of our future energy supply, and we realize that in particular the gas industry is looking at hybrid solutions for the transition phase. They increasingly offer their customers a technology that would work with gas today, but that is capable of operating with hydrogen in the future when it becomes available. Here we can very clearly see how industry is adapting. And maybe one remark to CCS or CCUS. We realize how prominently that figures in international discussions, but I think nationally we share some of the concerns that were just voiced by the Korean side. Where to store it? Will it be commercially viable? And I think also the public opinion in Germany is not very favorable with regard to that technology. So I think its value for our own transition purposes is maybe limited for political reasons. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 독일의 경우
Thank you very much. So in Germany, private financial institutions are sensitive, and they are also moving quickly toward climate change, and that is becoming one movement, and that gas can be used in the future with hydrogen, and that is an conversion of technology. And on CCS, just as Mr. Son said, where should it be stored, and is this technology stable? There are concerns, and that is why we should cautiously approach this technology. That was the part of his comment, and we have received a lot of questions from the floor. We would like to ask a question to Tom House from IEA. Recently in Europe, the wind power generated has been reduced due to reduction of wind, and there's also reduction in hydrogen power plants because of reduction in rainfall and rivers. So climate change may lead to differences in the renewable energy that can be produced. Does it require then additional investment into renewable energies compared to what has already been anticipated by IEA?
Certainly, I mean, climate change affects all aspects of our energy sector. We see it certainly with changing rainfall and the impact that has on our hydropower capacity production. We see it also in terms of over more long-term, I guess, wind and solar radiation patterns that may change. But these are relatively stable. We know of winter dips in wind, of summer peaks for solar. So these things are relatively predictable, not on a micro day-to-day basis, but seasonally. And these we can with that kind of understanding of future supply, we can adapt to that and make our systems work with those differences. And of course, the changing heat and changes in temperatures and water supply affects also our demand profiles altogether. So we have to bring in the demand side in terms of maintaining regular supply. And the water rainfall changes have had an even bigger impact, I would say, so far on our capacity to use thermal power plants. In Europe, at least, we've seen difficulties in cooling water supplies, which have affected the use of nuclear power stations, for instance. And in the cold temperature snaps in Texas most recently, we saw the severe impact that had literally on the pipelines and supply of gas and the use of gas power production. So climate change is affecting all the different aspects of our energy system, all the different production sources. And so that brings us back to the need to address climate change overall. And the way we do that is by reducing emissions, which does require the major investments in renewables that we're all talking about. In terms of the projections of the IA, these are given expectations of demand and resource availability. If those two aspects change, and I dare say they will change as climate change has a bigger impact, as extreme events make themselves more frequent, this will change the demand load curves that we're expecting, as well as impact on the feasibility of different energy sources of providing supply. So these are all arguments for why we need to carry on rapidly with mitigation and roll out further the renewable energies to replace the fossil fuels.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So climate change impact and how it also influences energy demand and also existing energy infrastructure. And so fundamentally, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that means we would have to roll out even more renewable energy. Thank you very much. Another question from the floor. This is for Mr. Peck from K-Shore. So at this point in time, if you look at the trend in energy transition, now fossil fuel industrial structure needs to change as well. So K-Shore and also the Korean government, when it comes to oil and natural gas, do you have any internal discussions at the moment what you're going to do with those fossil fuels going forward? Again, not an easy question to answer. As I mentioned earlier, K-Shore is responsible for supporting Korean export businesses. And when it comes to energy transition, it's not really closely related. So most of the countries that we work with are advanced countries, but as well as developed countries. So the policies that these countries introduce actually affect our decision. So if internationally energy mix gets strengthened and renewable energy increases its ratio in the energy mix. So what I'm trying to say is that as in compliance with the IEA scenario, if the international community moves towards that direction, then of course K-Shore is going to follow. And when it comes to regulatory or government rules and regulations, now, looking at K-Shore's portfolio, if the government tells us that we should ban certain overseas projects, we will. However, the government doesn't intervene to that degree. Independently, K-Shore can give incentives or disincentives for coal-related projects. Well, compared to if we do so, I think that we can put at an advantage or disadvantage Korean export businesses compared to other international players. So we are trying to comply with international and OECD rules. Just like coal financing is suspended when it comes to other fossil fuels, if other fossil fuels are targeted by the international community and banned, then the K-Shore is committed to follow suit. But at the same time, other than coal, I don't think that there is any strict disincentive or any clear ban on other energy sources. I'm not sure this answers the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So considering the role of a ECA, utilizing disincentive in order to encourage energy transition is a bit difficult, was his opinion. There are many questions, and there is a question, two questions for Peter Winkler from the Embassy of Germany. So there was the general election in Germany, and considering the election results, what do you think the climate change policy direction will be in the future? With the Green Party taking more seats, do you think there will be a change to the climate change policy? Could you answer? Peter Winkler? Please use the microphone.
Thank you very much. It's always difficult to comment on a constellation of government which doesn't exist yet. I'd rather limit my comment to some general remarks. I think generally, irrespective of the parties we are seeing in Germany, the environmental question has gained a lot of traction. And a particular attraction within the last 2 years, and I'm pretty sure that even irrespective of the parties, all major parties will focus and will put a huge emphasis on environmental change, on the climate change, on meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. This is also what President Steinmeier has said. So we will have continuity in our general policy line, and climate change, the fight against climate change, our international commitments, among others, meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, are one of the top priorities of our government, and I'm sure also of the future government.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Peck from K-Shore, you talked about whether you're going to provide incentives or disincentives to businesses, and making that decision is going to be very challenging. So, the need for energy transition. Regarding that, Mr. Christoph Wagner, you talked about how providing incentives to businesses can be useful. And what about disincentives? In selecting the policy tools, incentivizing or disincentivizing, what were the concerns?
Yes, thank you for this question. Now, if we recall my presentation, we are actually discussing using disincentives in the form of less favorable conditions for cover. That's an instrument we are intending to use. However, I think. And here I will echo maybe a bit what Mr. Beck from K-Shore already said. We are after all demand driven. So we provide cover for transactions that have been threshed out by stakeholders and that are being brought to us. So we have little influence on what is presented to us. And maybe to eliminate one common frequent misunderstanding between transactions that are brought to us, there is no trade-off. So if we provide, let's say, cover for a gas-fired power plant in Iraq, that does not mean that there are less resources for us to provide cover for, let's say, a wind park in Turkey. The resources are always there, so we can always do both. So if we provide cover for the gas-fired power plant in Iraq, that's not at the expense of renewable energies. The bottleneck always is, are there enough projects around, and are there enough applications filed to provide cover for renewable energies? We would very much like to see more, that's certainly something we need to look at. Why are there no more applications for cover for renewables? It's, I think, one, the structure of the projects. It's maybe also the nature of our conditions, especially, of course, since we are quite risk averse, we are hesitant to provide cover sometimes to developing countries, and this is, I think, where we really need to look into our incentives and how we could incentivize more. Disincentives, I think, are more a reflection of political priorities, and as I said, probably in the future, disincentives will be some sort of a early warning for industries that certain thresholds are no longer up to date, that they need to think about improving their products, because they are on the way out of receiving cover. So in short, disincentives are one element we are working with, but I think it's not the decisive one in the end.
네, 감사합니다.
Yes, thank you very much. Again, I think that utilizing both incentives and disincentives can be a very sensitive issue. And compared to disincentives, I guess utilizing incentives more is the approach of Germany at the moment.
During the discussion, as a presenter, I wanted to make a comment, and I kept on thinking about the role of public financing. Public financing, on top of its role of supporting Korean companies using limited public financing resources, I think that it can play a role in reducing the energy transition costs. And on coal power plants, Korea was a country that provided public support for coal power plants till the end. And this might have led to a situation in which these companies could lost the opportunity to move over and go on to other industries, such as wind power plants, for example. And this might actually have worked as a loss to these companies. In the long term, for stability of jobs and stability of companies, we should consider energy transition and think about it in a more long-term perspective. So we have received a lot of questions from the floor, and also our discussants and presenters provided very insightful answers. I was able to learn a lot through this session too. Would any of the panelists ask last questions? Any last questions? I would like to make a comment. So financial support from a company and from rather a country, and when a government discontinues its financial support, there has to be a consensus, such as consensus from OECD. And I agree to the comments made by Kay Shur, because we are making proposals for 2050 net zero according to IPCC, and the targets are different for different countries. For China, it's 2060 instead of 2050. And the 10 years difference, for example, it is because of the differences in industry, and this leads to differences in industry too. Let's say project financing, if we limit it and restrict coverage for LNG projects, then China and government financial public organizations of China will provide guarantee and coverage, which will lead to Chinese companies carrying out those projects. So this may lead to a situation that is not based on a consensus. So there should be an overall consensus on this on an OECD level. If we are the only ones that do this, then we might be overly burdening ourselves. And just as Attorney Yoon said, for coal power plants, we declared phasing out of coal, and we are considering efficiency, and Korean companies worked hard on adding efficiency and reducing cost and adding efficiency. Korean companies were at the forefront, and we are the best. And companies such as GE Siemens in the United States and Germany is the best in adding efficiency of energy. And there were ways in which guarantees could be provided by financial institutions providing financial guarantee to invest in these projects. So these industries are working together, and therefore we need to have a comprehensive viewpoint. Because we focused on coal, this might have led to a delay in renewable energy development that was mentioned. And to give my opinion on that, we worked on coal and did nuclear power plants and LNG, and we are supplying most of our power through these three energy sources. But we need to consider the location, the geographical location of a country. Korea does not have enough sunlight, and we do not have strong winds. We have differences compared to Germany. Germany has a stronghold in offshore wind power, and they have accomplished a lot in this area. In Korea, for us to pursue wind power, we have to come to a consensus with the fishery industry of Korea, and we lack awareness. And where we want to install solar power plants, we need a big mass of land, and we need to compensate for those who have to give up their land in order to establish renewable energy. Paradoxically, we have to have a complementary LNG power plants in order to create a stable renewable energy system. We also need to establish and also expand the transmission networks. The micro transmission, there were many complaints, and this has led to a discontinuation of the building new transmission lines. And this is a big hurdle and barrier in order to establish a renewable ecosystem. Therefore, we ask solutions for our climate and other related organizations to work on reducing a conflict in establishing a renewable energy ecosystem.
Yes, I would like to also say a few words. Within OECD, I believe that countries are discussing the role of ECAs, and I believe that they think about environmental issues, but at the same time, they have national interests. So I think that industrialized countries are leading the discussions and developing countries are following. And second point I'd like to mention is that ECAs, especially ECAs within OECD, their mission has to do with exporting to developing countries. We're talking about decarbonization and also carbon neutrality, but developing countries have yet to declare carbon neutrality. So this is an issue with related to them. We talk about phasing out coal, but on one side we get criticism. Even if Korea does coal decarbonization, there can be some developing countries that builds coal power. Again, if the actions are taken only within the OECD framework, then other developing countries outside the framework of OECD may develop and generate power using coal. Another point I'd like to mention is that in developing countries, using renewables to generate power is going to be very costly. And that is why developing countries need to chip in one way or the other. Or else our decarbonization efforts will not be that effective or bring out concrete results. So that is one of our concerns at K-Shore. K-Shore, again, has the mission of promoting our Korean exporters. And yes, we want to help them to become more eco-friendly and develop their eco-friendly business portfolios. So with that in mind, I hope that K-Shore can contribute to addressing climate change issues. Thank you. Thank you.
Peter Winkler will provide his last comments.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me first of all say again how much I was impressed about the in-depth of these discussions today. And I've been here now for 2 years and tackling also climate change issues. In these 2 years of German, Korean, European, Korean cooperation on energy, on climate issues, it is extremely remarkable to see how far we have come in this discussion. And referring to what Ambassador Reifenstuhl had said, also on what this government, in the Korean government, has done, has announced, and with regard to new goals, with regards to raising climate ambition, I really have to say we have come a very, very long way. I agree with what has been said from both Dr. Pek Sundal and Dr. Sohn from Samsung. Energy transition is not an easy one. I think we can all agree about this, and it is also it doesn't come cheap. But now is the time where we are seeing that recovery programs are rolled out. A lot of money is being spent on recovery post-COVID, and we have to focus now on how we spend this money and in which areas this money is being put. Money, this was also said here already, is very limited, particularly when we are talking of public actors and when we are talking of incentivizing. So we really need to see how we prioritize our assets. And I really think it is a good way to look forward and not to look backward. And I think this is also something I've been taking from this discussion, that we've come very far. We are actually doing this in Europe. Korea is doing it too. We are setting goals on the one hand, changing the regulatory framework. On the other hand, I agree, we need to see how we can take business and industry on board. And this is also a point which has been made several times here. Korea and Germany share many similarities when it comes to the industry structure. We are both heavily relying on manufacturing, on heavy industry, on energy intensive industries like steel, like cement, traffic too, certainly. And so the problems are the same. But I think they can be tackled. I think we need to take the business sector on board, also certainly with incentive programs. And as you've been mentioning, Dr. Peck, it is necessary that we also need the population on board. I mean, there is problems which we are facing also with our populations in Germany. For instance, when it comes to wind power or environmental challenges, like with the farming industry here, for instance, or with ecological aspects. But these can be tackled. We have been trying to solve this. And I think we have been on a good way on this, making this process of energy transition very, very inclusive in creating, for instance, a coal commission, bringing different all sorts of concerned sectors on board and discuss it and find solutions. And I'm pretty sure that this is also a feasible way here in Korea. And I would possibly not agree on the judgment that renewable energy is not too much feasible here. I think Korea has the high potential, the innovation. Korea ranks now #1 or number within the first 10 countries in the Bloomberg innovation countries. So if Korea doesn't manage this problem, I don't know which country does. And I think many of the companies here in Korea are on a very, very good way also when it comes to renewable energy. And I think this is a huge sector with a growth potential. So I think this really should be followed this way and possibly not the other one. And I agree with the IAEA that LNG will certainly play a role, but the period in which it plays a role will be shortened, basically. And this is something, so Germany and Korea, I guess, have a lot of potential to work together. And we do this, among others, in our energy partnership, and we would like to continue with this. We can profit a lot also from the Korean side. And this was highly productive for us today. And we would like to continue on this. Thank you very much.
네, 빈클러
Thank
부대사님.
you very much, Deputy Head of Mission, Mr. Peter Winkler. I think that you summarized pretty well the entire discussion that we had. So with that, I would like to wrap up our roundtable discussion session and move on to our next program. Once again, thank you very much. I would like to send my appreciation to all the panel discussants for sharing with us your valuable insights. Again, here we have the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany, the National Assembly, MP Lee So-young's office, Climate Transparency and Solutions for Our Climate, co-hosting this event. And before we close, from Climate Transparency, we have Program Director, Mr. Gert Leipold. And I would like to invite him over for his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much. This was a very exciting webinar this morning, and I think lots of excellent presentations and a debate which covered so well the different aspects. Considering the time, I want to limit my comments to some very short remarks on 5 key observations I made on the climate crisis, the role of fossil fuels, change in the energy system, the role of finance and export credits, and finally about cooperation. On the climate crisis, I don't think there's any doubt that we are in a climate crisis, but also, and this seminar today has shown, climate has become a mainstream issue. It is no longer an issue of environmental ministries, environmental organization, and academics. It is in the central part of business and politics. What we probably had always in the background today, but didn't explicitly say, is that if we do nothing, the cost of climate change in terms of human life, human health, economic problems, major disasters will be huge. And we shouldn't forget that as we talk about the difficulties of transitioning our energy system, which are huge, but not doing anything, I think, carries much bigger risks and probably much higher costs. What about the role of fossil fuels? Well, if we want to reach mid-century net zero, it's very obvious that they need to be reduced strongly. I think we can safely assume that coal is on the way out. There is still a debate to be had about the role of gas, and especially gas as a bridging fuel. I think we heard strong arguments today that it's of limited value to the climate. And as we heard repeatedly, as decisions in the energy sector are long-term decisions, therefore, the longer we prolong gas, the more difficult is the challenge to deal with the climate objectives. What we can observe, and this was demonstrated for Korea, is that there's still a lot of public support for fossil fuels. It's too much of fossil fuel. Korea is not alone. Other countries do so as well, in spite of the protestations and the intentions of the G20. I think the public support for fossil fuel is counterproductive in terms of reaching of climate objectives. The transformation of the energy system is a huge challenge, and I think it was underscored by what we heard in the presentation of the IEA, saying that we will need a 7-fold increase of spending in the energy sector till 2030. That is less than 10 years ago. And what is equally difficult is the fact that where the needs are most for these investments, the availability of finance and the cost of finance, the availability is low and the cost of finance is higher. This is clearly an international task that needs to be expressed. One key challenge in this transition is that energy investments are long-term investments, have a long legacy. And that this is underscored, especially in Asia, where 80% of the infrastructure is relatively young. So any decision we make today for fossil fuel has long-term consequences. We've heard that there is opportunities in creating new jobs, but we've also heard that this transition is a challenge for existing jobs, and that also for those parts of countries that are dependent on fossil fuel so far, a fair transition is an important element. It was interesting to learn more about public finance and in particular export credits. And there's a clear shift of export credit agencies that climate consideration, environmental considerations play a much bigger role than they did in the past. So the understanding of what public finance and in particular export credits agencies can do is changing, and is changing to reflect the needs of the climate. There again, the challenge of stranded assets is a huge one, and we all have heard about the decision of China to no longer support internationally coal projects. And I think there were some people who were saying that this had less to do with a sort of a bold decision for the climate, but it had more to do with avoiding unnecessary financial risk for the Chinese economy and the Chinese government. It was also good to point out that finance is an important precondition, but if you do the right thing, we need the right projects. And we need to identify what can be done in Germany, what can be done in Korea, what is the possibility for renewable energy. And I think it is much bigger than we often assume. And finally, I think this seminar has shown the value of exchanging experience and the need for cooperation. And It's a huge task we have in front of us. But once again, if we don't undertake this, we shouldn't think life becomes easier. Life becomes more difficult if we don't do anything, and it becomes more exciting if we go the right path towards net zero and a climate neutrality in mid-century. Thank you very much. This was a very exciting and very useful day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we will conclude today's seminar. Thank you for your time. Once again, thank you.